Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our weekly webcast with our founder and chairman, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Today is November 3rd, 2019, and we're in the midst of an insurgency that's moving to every day almost a higher level worldwide against the neoliberal policies, the neoconservative strategic policies. It's shaking the roots of the British Empire and its satraps around the world. Helga, maybe we can start with some developments in the United States. You had a chance to watch some of the rally of President Trump in Tupelo, Mississippi. What's your impression of that?
Well, if you listen to or read the media, at least here in Germany, you would think, that these are really the last hours in office for Trump, that the impeachment is unstoppable, that it's just a question of time. And, the reality is quite different. I mean, and I would really urge you, our viewers, to absolutely not just read and listen to the media, but, go on YouTube, look at this rally speech Trump gave in Tupelo, in Mississippi. And, it gives you a completely different sense. What is the connection between Trump and the American, at least a good section of the American population, who are quite electrified, who are totally polarized? It's completely different than in Europe, especially very different than in Germany, because the population gets very much enraged about what the Democrats are doing. And they're making a very high risk game right now, because this can backfire big time. And, if you look at this rally, Trump was very feisty, very much in direct connection with the population. And he blasted the whole conspiracy against him. He said the first phase was the so-called Russiagate. Out of that came absolutely nothing. Then came the Mueller investigation, which resulted in absolutely zero evidence of him having been in collusion with Russia. And then now you have the third phase, which is this unbelievable witch hunt with the effort to go for impeachment. Now, this is a big scandal. And, as my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, had said, when Trump won the election in 2016, he had correctly said at that time, this is not an internal development to the United States, but this has global implication. And, that it was part of this global growing rebellion against the neoliberal policies of the British Empire. And, in a certain sense, what we see right now is the showdown between the forces of that British Empire, which have pretty much captured the Democratic Party from the top. And naturally, the former intelligence apparatus of the Obama administration is, insofar as they're still in office, they're still at it. But you have also the absolute opposite, namely that with the Attorney General Barr having declared this all to be a criminal investigation, the mood is shifting, and people have to watch if they are not caught, being involved in something which could lead to a accusation of obstruction of justice, or even being involved in a conspiracy against the President of the United States. So this is hot. This is absolutely hot. And I can only urge you, our viewers, use your own intelligence. Do not go by the media. Listen to what Trump is saying. Form yourself your own opinion, because this battle in the United States right now is probably the absolute, the dot on the T or the I, or whatever you say, which will determine which way this historical period will. So follow our revelations and read our materials, because the best thing is subscribe to our newsletter, get in touch with us, because this is a battle which is determining the future of civilization.
We have repeatedly emphasized that this is a coup, not an impeachment. And the fact that the Democratic Party is almost universally supporting it doesn't make it less of a coup. The Democrats are now a regime change party trying to change the regime in the United States. The vote in the House was 232 to 196, with all but 2 Democrats voting for the impeachment, in spite of the fact that there's nothing that's been brought forward on Ukraine. Now, Helga, we've seen some very interesting things coming out. The role of the so-called whistleblower, Chiaramella. You may have some things to say on that. And also, importantly, former CIA analyst Larry Johnson's presentation to our call the other night. This is looking just like an extension of the coup in 2014 in Ukraine, isn't it?
Yes, because is a very interesting article by an investigative journalist with the name of Paul Sperry, who in real investigative journalism, or no, I'm sorry, you can correct me, Harley, if you know the website, the blog.
Clear Investigations.
Real Clear Investigations, yes. So he has a very interesting article there where he says that, while officially the identity of this whistleblower who triggered the whole impeachment against Trump is not known, because the Democrats are frantically trying to, to somehow hide the identity of this person, that everybody inside the Beltway knows who he is. And he says, because so much is at stake with the impeachment, that he reveals this name, and it is a guy, Eric Chiaramella, who is 33 years old, who used to be a CIA analyst and then was deployed for a short period of time into the White House. And now he is back working for the CIA at Langley. Now, the specific background of this person, Chiaramella, is that he used to work for Joe Biden and Susan Rice in the critical period of the coup against the Kiev government, the Maidan coup. And his expertise is the Ukraine. He speaks, I think, Ukrainian and some other languages, but he was sort of working for Biden, who was the point person of Obama for the Ukraine in this period, 2013, 14, 15, 16. And therefore, what is really here at stake is the entire policy of the containment against Russia, the effort to, this was an elaborated operation which started in November 2013, when the EU tried to lure the Ukrainian government into the EU association agreement, which Yanukovych in the very last moment jumped out of, because he realized that this was an untenable situation, because it would have opened the Russian markets for EU goods and flooded the Russian economy with goods which they could not compete against. It would have opened the gateway for NATO access to the Black Sea. So in any case, as people remember, in November 2013, Yanukovych opted out, and that then immediately led to the demonstrations in the Maidan. And in a few days, these demonstrations were basically taken over by successors of the Bandera organization, meaning real Nazis. And they were then heavily involved in the coup in February 2014. And this was the famous incident when Victoria Nuland was talking to Pyatt, the US ambassador at that time, about getting Yatsenyuk in. So this was all, the story why the son of Biden was in the Burisma oil company, oil and gas company, and he got there a very high salary for having really no specific expertise. But, so the whole Burisma case, which then Trump asked Zelensky to look into, why was the prosecutor who looked into the Burisma firm, why was he fired? Now, this all happened in a phone discussion between Trump and President Zelensky in July. And, basically, this was then construed by the Democrats saying, that this was a blackmail, that Trump threatened to withhold military aid to the Ukraine, that this was a quid pro quo. And this is the reason why he should be impeached. Now, there is absolutely nothing to it. There are some statements, from the present US ambassador in Kiev, which claims that, Trump said something different than he did. But Trump, in an interview with the Washington Examiner just a very short while ago, suggested that he goes on national TV and reads the transcript of that phone discussion with President Zelensky. So, there are other witnesses who basically say that there was absolutely nothing illegal in the discussion between Trump and Zelensky. Zelensky himself absolutely denied that there was any quid pro quo. So the whole story is so unbelievably blown up, but there is no substance because, as this transcript will prove, Trump just did foreign policy, what every president should do. And therefore, the blowback potential of this whole story is absolutely enormous.
And I just want to highlight 2 points, and there's so many points here. I would urge people to go to the LaRouchePAC.com site to look at our new report from Barbara Boyd called Ukrainegate, the coup against President Donald Trump, Phase 3. But Ciaramella was assigned to the White House by his CIA director, John Brennan, who, of course, is under enormous pressure from the Barr-Durham investigation. The other thing that I think is important is that at the Schiff hearings, where the Republicans still have not had access to the documentation that's being churned out by Schiff and his people, including a lot of dishonest and lying transcripts, they haven't been able to cross-examine. But many of the people who are testifying from the State Department and intelligence who are making up these stories about Trump's call were part of the Ukraine coup in 2014. Now, some of this was brought out by Larry Johnson in a discussion with our supporters the other day. What did you find about Johnson's revelations that were most significant?
Well, I really liked the way how he opened up his discussion, because he said that he likes irony. And the irony is that we, meaning the LaRouche movement, have always been accused of being conspiracy theorists. But now we are in the absolute middle of proving the biggest conspiracy theory, or biggest conspiracy actually in history ever. So I think the most interesting point otherwise he made is that there was a sudden reversal, because while the intelligence bureaucracy had tried to prevent the report of Horowitz. Horowitz is the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, who had been preparing over a long period of time a report looking into the wrongdoings around the lies to the FISA court. This is the court which can, in secrecy, order taping of people and so forth. So the intelligence community tried to prevent that report from coming out for about 2 months after it was ready, because they are apparently, according to Johnson, all aware of how damaging this material will be for such people as Brennan, Klepper, Comey, McCabe, and various other people. But that basically, when it became clear that that the Attorney General Barr has declared a criminal investigation into all of these procedures, they completely switched their behavior, because they didn't want to be caught in something which would turn out to be a obstruction of justice, or an actual conspiracy. And he referred to the very interesting case of the lawyer of General Flynn, Sidney Powell, who had basically produced the evidence that there was such an direct interference to David Ignatius from the Washington Post writing articles which then were, creating the environment for General Flynn to be indicted. Now, what Larry Johnson also accounts is that Flynn pleaded guilty at a certain point, basically because he had an enormous cost of lawyers to pay, and they started to also involve his son. So he made a plea bargain deal, and then they said, oh well, he's already guilty, so there's nothing we can do, even if it was a Brady violation. Brady violation refers to the fact that the government had exculpatory evidence which they did not give to Flynn. So this is really a big story. And remember that General Flynn was the one who had spilled the beans early on the whole US intelligence support for the jihadis, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and so forth. So this is all now, being unraveled, and I think this is going to be an incredible story. And one has to say, you don't have to like President Trump, and I know many people in Europe absolutely don't, but it is really an amazing fact that this man has the courage to stand up against these people who are in an open revolt. And basically he says the Democrats have gone completely crazy, and it is quite an amazing fact that they are Pelosi and people who should know better. They can never win the election 2020 by going only for the impeachment against Trump. And if all of this comes out anytime before 2020, and it's more likely than not, this will lead to an earthquake in the United States and worldwide, as the world probably has never seen it.
There are two other developments I'd like your comments on that show that Trump, the characterization of Trump as inept or bullying or incompetent or completely wrong. One is developments in Syria, where there's now a constitutional process underway from a meeting in Geneva. And the other is the breakthrough on the US-China trade talks. What can you tell us about that?
Well, to start with that, I think this is promising, because both sides, the Chinese and Trump, said that the first phase of this deal looks very good, and that Xi Jinping agreed to come to the United States to sign that agreement, and he may very well come to Iowa because part of the deal is a very large export of agricultural goods from Iowa and other farm states. So I think that could be a very important rekindling of the good relationship between Trump and Xi Jinping, which they had at the beginning. Obviously, related to that indirectly is the fact that there is now absolute progress, despite some things which need to be straightened out, like the oil question in Syria. But in general, I think the Syrian process is on a good way. The Constitutional Council started to meet in Geneva with the aim to have soon a new constitution, to have a new election, and then have the Syrian people elect who they want to be their government. And at the same time, there is in the background a rapprochement between an actual cooperation on that matter between the United States and Russia, and implicitly also with China, which has agreed to be very helpful in the reconstruction of Syria. So I would really appeal to you, our viewers and listeners, that rethink all of these questions. What is the most important to maintain world peace? It is the collaboration between the United States, Russia, China, and naturally other countries, which should be in collaboration with these larger nations. So I think that this is a historic moment which is extremely dangerous. I mean, there's no question about it that it's totally dangerous. But on the other side, I think it has an enormous potential to lead to a completely new epoch in the history of civilization. So all the more reason to be active with us and be optimistic.
And as you've emphasized for a long time, It's this attack on geopolitics, the doctrine of that the British have used for these never-ending wars and never-ending austerity, that the fear that Trump is breaking with that is what's behind the attempt to get rid of him. Now, we also have the other factor is the ongoing financial collapse. There's a lot to report on that coming out. Why don't you just go through what you have, Helga, because it's becoming more and more apparent that something is going to happen soon, and it better be steps to counteract this bailout, this hyper bailout policy.
Well, now Draghi is out. That may not be so good for the Italian people because there is a big push to make him president of Italy, which may not function, but the push is there. But unfortunately, he is being replaced by Christine Lagarde, who is determined to continue his policy of quantitative easing, of asset buying through the EZB. And there is a big push also in some financial media picking up on the proposal which was originally made by BlackRock to the annual conference in Jackson Hole, where they proposed that there should be just helicopter money given to the consumers, to the households directly, so that they would buy and then basically get the economy going. Now that's an insane proposal because while the negative interest rates and zero interest rates are already eating up the pensions and the savings of the people, because the inflation rate is higher than the interest they don't get from from their savings. But if you would have helicopter money, you would enter exactly what happened in 1923 in Germany, a hyperinflation, which would completely destroy the income of the general population. Now, this is an insane push, and there is Lagarde now attacked Germany and Holland that they are not doing enough. But I think that it is the experience of 1923 which sits in the bones of the German people, because every family recounted that, and even if you didn't experience it yourself, you have heard stories, you have seen the money of 1923, the Reichsmark, being completely worthless in the end. So Jens Weidmann, who is the president of the Bundesbank, at a recent conference of the Bundesbank end of last month, end of October, basically said he agrees that that part of the tasks of the central bank is to estimate the risk factors, and included in that is the risk of climate change. But he said he absolutely opposes the idea that it is the central banks which should basically direct money into the green financing. And he mentioned Mark Carney several times as the person who obviously was presenting this idea of regime change in Jackson Hole, where he said that from now on the central banks should make the monetary policy and not the governments anymore. So I find it very important that Weidmann opposes this by saying that the central banks do not have the democratic legitimacy to do that, but it is the task of the politicians to make such a decision. Now, that's not yet the great, policy shift which would be needed, but at least somebody is still there who makes the argument that if the central banks are taking over, and remember that Mark Carney also had the idea to replace the dollar with a global synthetic cyber currency, it would be basically a world dictatorship of green finance. And Jens Weidmann obviously is opposing that. So I think this is very important. It's, as I said, it's a stopgap. It's not the solution, but at least you have somebody who has not gone completely crazy and who defends at least the semi stable monetary policy, or rather blocks the kind of hyperinflation which Lagarde is obviously pushing.
Well, we're also seeing, as part of the global upsurge against neoliberalism, farmers on the march in Germany. We just saw another vote in Thüringen where the political parties, the leading parties in Germany, were smashed. What's your sense of the mood here? Is Weidemann reflecting something, or is he in front of something?
Well, I think, there is a growing awareness that, this thing is not functioning. I have here some figures, which I want to actually read. There is a Forsa poll, which says that 80% of the German population today think that there have been too many privatizations leading to negative consequences for pensions and the health sector. 87% of the people in Germany think the income gap is becoming a problem for the cohesion of society, meaning the rich are getting too rich and more people getting poor. 62% think that the top rich echelons have their wealth undeserved. 81% think fear that they may fall into poverty. 83% think there is a risk of social decline for them in the next several years. So, I mean, that is really, I think, a symptom. And you mentioned the German farmers who are now organizing themselves outside of the German Farmers Association, the Deutsche Bauernverband, because they don't feel any longer represented by that institution, which is thoroughly discredited for many decades, as a matter of fact. But they are now recruiting 1,000 farmers a day. They organized 100,000 farmers within 3 weeks, and they're planning a major, big demonstration towards the end of this month. So I think there is, for the first time, some real serious social ferment breaking out in Germany, of all places, which was the least, willing to wake up to what the situation is. Another symptom is obviously the vote in Thuringia, where the Linkspartei won 3%, the AfD doubled their vote, while the parties of the Grand Coalition all collapsed. The SPD is down to 8%. I mean, that's really almost, in a free fall. And obviously the attempt by the CDU to block a CDU left combination, which would be the only one, since nobody wants to make a coalition with the AfD, which would work. This is, very close to an ungovernability in Thuringia, and that is probably just a foreboding of things to come. But naturally, the situation in Germany is just one of many. You have a global mass strike process in Chile. Despite total police brutality, the people are still out in the streets in masses, so that President Piñera had to cancel both the APEC summit, which has not been, rescheduled, and the COP25 summit, which now takes place in Madrid, which leaves Greta stranded without a boat to travel there, at least so far. So, then you have mass demonstrations. Argentina is completely hot with the new government of Fernandez and Cristina Kirchner. That looks better, but it's a very hot situation because the Argentine economy, as a result of the IMF policies, is in a complete chaotic and terrible condition. Demonstrations in other places, Bolivia, Haiti is completely collapsing. Then naturally Iraq, Pakistan, other countries are in a similar condition. So I think what we see is a global disintegration of the system, and that is not even with the coming collapse of the financial system. So the time to go for the reforms we are proposing for many years, which are all the the ideas of Lynns and LaRouche, these must be put on the table, because there is simply no other solution which would guarantee the survival of civilization.
Well, Helga, I did a radio show this last week in a station in Iowa, And the host was asking about our coverage of the coup, our coverage of why we say the British Empire rather than simply the deep state. And I went through Lynns' economic solutions. And at a certain point, she said, wow, I wish I would have known about LaRouche all these years. This makes so much sense. And I think it would be good, as we've just been reviewing the collapse of the system, for you to restate both the policies of your husband, but also the prospects for these being implemented.
Well, you know, my husband many years ago said that the only combination of countries which is powerful enough to oppose this British Empire, and remember, when we say British Empire, we don't mean the British subjects, the poor British people who are, you know, living in a monarchy. We mean with British Empire this new system of central banks, of investment banks, of reinsurance companies, of hedge funds, that system which has been favoring the high risk speculation for the advantage of a few at the expense of many. And what he said at the time is that you need 4 large nation states to be powerful enough to cause a change of the system. Namely, you need the collaboration between the United States, Russia, China, and India, not at the exclusion of other countries, but simply because these 4 countries, if they would work together, are representative enough also of the developing sector that they could really speak for the world community and act for the world community. So what it would require is the immediate implementation of a global Glass-Steagall law, the separation of the banks, the protection of the commercial banks, the basically leaving it to the investment banks on their own. You know, if they're bankrupt, they should close down. If not, then, you know, one can think what they can do in a different environment. But most of them are bankrupt and they should just close down. Then naturally you have a lack of liquidity, so you need to immediately go to a credit system as it was defined by Alexander Hamilton. You need a national bank in every country, and then these national banks have to cooperate in a new credit system, a new Bretton Woods system, which would make sure you have cheap long-term credit for investment in the real economy, in infrastructure. And obviously, the good thing is that, you know, this is not just a programmatic demand anymore, but, you know, with the Belt and Road Initiative, 157 countries and many international organizations are already cooperating according to principles at least going in this direction. So obviously the missing link in all of this is the United States. And, you know, that is why the relationship between Trump and Xi Jinping is so absolutely crucial, because, you know, unless the 2 largest economies are working together, there is no way how we get out of this crisis. And obviously, for strategic reasons, Russia must be absolutely in this combination. And I think then the inclusion of India is really not very difficult given the present policies of the Modi government and China and Russia. So I think this is very close. We can have that. And I think part of the absolute fury against Trump and the insane escalation by the crazy Democrats, as Trump calls them, is because they don't want a person in the White House who could, under circumstances of crisis, actually go in this direction and implement such a policy. And that is the real background. If you don't understand that, then, you know, you're missing the whole point, what the strategic battle is all about. So rather than looking at this as a passive observer or some pessimist saying, oh, you can't do anything anyway, get active with us. I mean, this is a moment in history where, you know, you absolutely have to help. And we have a lot of things we are doing. You know, we are an international organization. We have many activities you can join in every country. You can contact us, help to spread the webcast, sign up to our newsletter. You know, just get active. there are many activities we can do together to change the course of history in a better direction. I mean, it's a moment which Friedrich Schiller would call a pregnant moment, and you should not miss it.
Well, you took the words right out of my mouth when I was going to encourage people to make sure they circulate this webcast, get people to go to LaRouchePAC.com, and make sure we win this fight, because we don't want to have another lost opportunity. We may not have another chance. So Helga, thanks for joining us this week, and we'll see you next week.
Yes, till next week.